They stole my slippers and laughed like it was funny, like I was furniture that walked around the house, an invisible ghost they could torment without consequence. It wasn't just a prank, it was a message, a quiet erasure disguised as humor. I remember the exact moment I realized how deep the betrayal cut, standing barefoot on the cold linoleum kitchen floor, clutching the empty air where my slippers had always been. Those slippers weren't just soft fabric on my feet. They were a memory stitched with love and loss, worn down by years of quiet mornings and lonely evenings. They were a gift from my late husband, handed to me on a chilly autumn day decades ago, when the leaves were just turning gold and the air smelled of wood smoke. He had smiled shyly, the kind of smile only a man who loved you more than life itself can give, as he slipped those slippers onto my feet for the first time, and I felt like I was wrapped in his arms even when he wasn't there. Now those slippers were stolen, tossed aside like some forgotten joke, and the laughter that followed was not the kind of warmth I had once known, but a cold, cutting edge that sliced through the heart of everything I had believed family to be. I'm 81 years old, living in a small retirement home on the edge of St. Louis, a place that smells faintly of old wood and polished shoes, where time moves slowly and memories linger like shadows in the corners of each room. I live alone, though I am surrounded by others who shuffle by with their walkers and their whispered conversations. Some days, the walls feel too close, the silence too heavy, but I have grown used to the quiet. This is my home now, but it was not always so. There was a time when I was surrounded by the noise and chaos of a family, when laughter meant connection, when the sound of footsteps on the porch made my heart beat a little faster in hope and expectation. That hope was shattered one afternoon when the slippers disappeared, and with them, the fragile thread that tied me to the people I once called my own. It happened during a family visit, a day that was supposed to be filled with warmth and reunion, but instead was marked by subtle cruelty dressed as jest. My children and grandchildren, the ones I had nurtured and loved with all my heart, decided it would be hilarious to take my slippers and hide them from me, gleefully watching as I shuffled around barefoot, confused and hurt. They filmed me, the old woman stumbling in her bare feet, and posted the video in a private family group chat, laughing with emojis that made the wound sting even more. I found out not from them, but from a stranger, someone who recognized the pain behind my forced smile and reached out quietly. The betrayal was not loud or violent. It was a slow, creeping poison that dissolved the bonds I had believed unbreakable. I was no longer their mother, their grandmother. I was a punchline. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere at family gatherings shifted imperceptibly but irrevocably. What began as teasing became a pattern of patronizing comments and condescending smiles, of gifts that infantilized rather than honored me. A walker decked out with balloons, a mug with a childish slogan, slippers in neon colors that screamed senior, citizen. My words were met with laughter, my complaints with dismissive shrugs. Even the staff here, in this home where I now live, took to calling me Slipper Queen, a nickname meant to amuse, but which felt like a crown of thorns pressed upon my head. I was isolated, diminished, erased bit by bit until I began to doubt my own worth. The people who should have been my protectors became the architects of my invisibility, and the house that once held echoes of love now echoed only with silence. But beneath the surface of that quiet erosion, something stubborn and fierce still lived. One afternoon, while rummaging through a dusty old box in my closet, I found a set of tools, my husband's tools from years ago, worn and well-used, the wood of the handles smooth from decades of repair work done together. Holding that hammer in my hand, feeling the familiar weight and texture, I was flooded with memories, not of helplessness, but of strength and agency. I remembered how we had built a life side by side, how no problem was too small to fix, how even the tiniest repair carried meaning. That moment became a turning point, the spark that lit a fire inside me. I would not be the subject of their jokes any longer. I would claim back my dignity, even if it meant standing alone. The next family visit arrived with an uneasy air. The house was filled with laughter and chatter, but beneath it lay a tension I could almost taste. As the children removed their shoes at the door, a ritual they performed with no thought, I quietly retrieved the hammer and nails I had hidden in my room. With deliberate calm, I went to the entryway and nailed every single one of their shoes to the hardwood floor. The sound of the hammer striking nail on wood echoed softly in the room, a quiet but unyielding declaration of my presence. When they returned and saw what I had done, the laughter died instantly. Their eyes widened and the air thickened with an awkward silence. I sat there sipping my tea, wearing my worn slippers with pride, and said simply, "I thought we were still playing jokes. This one's mine." There was no anger in my voice, only a quiet strength they had not expected. Their reaction was not what I had imagined. Instead of fury or shame, the eldest grandson let out a soft laugh, not mocking but respectful, as if for the first time he truly saw me. The others stood speechless, caught between embarrassment and a dawning realization that I was no longer the passive figure they had taken for granted. Days later, that same grandson sent me a photo of his nailed shoes, neatly placed by the wall with the caption, "All under control, Grandma." It was a small gesture, but it meant the world, a subtle truce in a battle I had long thought lost. In the days that followed, the house felt different. I walked in my slippers with a new lightness, aware of the space I occupied, the respect I demanded. Other residents noticed, and a few even joked with me, asking if they should bring their shoes for me to fix. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as a relic or a joke, but as a woman who refused to be erased. A granddaughter came to visit alone, bringing a small notebook and asking me to write down stories, memories, things I had never shared. "I want to learn who you really are," she said softly. And in that moment, I understood that my fight was not just about slippers or nails, but about reclaiming my identity and voice. Some jokes aren't funny, and sometimes the punchline has a hammer. This story is mine, but if it finds you, know this. Dignity is not something others give you, it's something you take. And when they try to make you invisible, sometimes all you need is to nail your place firmly in the world. The moment I realized this was no harmless joke, but a calculated betrayal, came quietly, almost invisibly, yet it shattered the fragile calm I had been holding on to. It wasn't a sudden shout or an angry confrontation that opened my eyes. It was the silence after the laughter died down, the cold absence where warmth should have been, and the unmistakable feeling that I had become nothing more than a prop in a story. Written without my consent, the catalyst for everything was that stolen pair of slippers, yes, but more than that, it was the way my family treated the entire episode as if it were just a bit of fun, a harmless prank to be brushed off with smiles and, "You're too sensitive," remarks. But beneath their casual dismissal lay something far more painful, a deliberate message that I no longer belonged in their lives the way I once did, that I had become a relic to be mocked rather than a mother and grandmother to be respected. It happened during one of their weekend visits. I was sitting in my favorite chair, the one by the window where the afternoon sun fell just right and warmed my hands as I held my knitting. The house was filled with the usual buzz, children running through the hallways, voices rising and falling, the scent of fresh coffee mingling with the faint perfume of my daughter-in-law. I felt a flicker of hope, that maybe today would be different, that laughter might once again mean joy instead of ridicule. Then the moment came. I noticed my slippers were missing. At first, I thought I had simply misplaced them, a common enough occurrence at my age. But as the minutes passed and the footsteps of the children grew louder in other rooms, I understood they were nowhere to be found. I shuffled into the living room, calling softly, "Has anyone seen my slippers?" The laughter that greeted me was not warm or affectionate, but sharp and biting. My eldest grandson appeared from around the corner, holding my slippers high above his head like a prize. "Looking for these, Grandma?" he teased, his eyes glinting with mischief. Before I could respond, his cousins gathered around, snickering and whispering behind their hands, the echo of their amusement filling the room like a cold draft. They began to tease me, making jokes about my barefoot wanderings and pretending to set traps around the house to catch me without my shoes. It was all recorded on phones, their voices overlapping with laughter, as if I were a character in a comedy they had scripted for their own entertainment. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation, a deep ache settling in my chest that was heavier than any physical pain. My hands trembled as I reached out for the slippers, but they were pulled just beyond my grasp, snatched away by quick fingers and sly grins. The last thing I heard before they turned away was the soft ding of a notification on one of their phones. The video had been shared, sent not just to family but to a wider circle, a social media platform where strangers might laugh at my expense. I was frozen, not from the cold but from the sudden realization that my suffering was now a spectacle. What cut the deepest was the absence of any apology or regret. Later, when I confronted my son quietly, trying to understand why they had treated me this way, he looked at me with a tired smile that did not reach his eyes. "It was just a joke," he said dismissively, as if that phrase could erase the sting of betrayal. "You're overreacting. We all need to lighten up a bit." The casual tone, the impatience beneath it, wounded me more than any harsh word could have. It was the unmistakable voice of someone who no longer saw me as a person with feelings, but as a relic to be managed, or worse, laughed at behind closed doors. Days passed, but the weight of that moment lingered, growing heavier with each quiet meal, each awkward silence at family gatherings where the stolen slippers were never mentioned, as if pretending it hadn't happened would make it disappear. I found myself shrinking inside, avoiding their calls, retreating into the solitude of my small room where the only sound was the soft rustle of my knitting needles and the distant hum of life outside my window. The betrayal was not just in the theft of my slippers, but in the collective denial of my pain, the unspoken agreement to erase me from the narrative of their lives. And yet, even in that darkness, a quiet resolve began to take root. I realized that this act of cruelty, as small as it might seem to them, was the final thread in a long unraveling of respect and dignity. It was the moment I understood that the family I had known was changing, or perhaps revealing itself, and that I could no longer play the part of the quiet, compliant mother or grandmother. The slippers, simple as they were, had become a symbol of everything I had lost: the right to be seen, to be honored, to belong. The catalyst did not end with anger or tears. It marked the beginning of a journey I was forced to take alone. I began to see the cracks in the facade of my family's kindness, the subtle ways they dismissed me as an inconvenience rather than an elder deserving of care and respect. Their laughter, once comforting and full of love, now felt like a barrier, a wall I had to find a way around or through. The stolen slippers were a betrayal, yes, but they also became the spark that ignited my need to reclaim my voice, my space, and my dignity. As the days turned into weeks, I noticed how the dynamics shifted. The children, sensing that their joke had landed poorly, tried to smooth things over with small, hollow gestures, a brightly colored pair of slippers that I refused to wear, overly sweet notes left on my bedside table, invitations to family dinners I no longer felt part of. The facade of normalcy was fragile, and I could see it crumble beneath the weight of unspoken truths and growing distance. My family was no longer the safe harbor I had believed it to be. It was a place where I was no longer recognized, where my presence was a source of discomfort or amusement, but never of genuine connection. One afternoon I sat by the window, watching the leaves fall in slow spirals outside, and I thought about the journey ahead. The catalyst had forced me to confront a painful reality, that love could be conditional, that family ties could fray and snap under the strain of neglect and cruelty. But it had also awakened something else inside me, a fierce determination not to disappear quietly, not to become just another forgotten face in a room full of strangers. I resolved to find a way back to myself, to remember who I was beneath the layers of disappointment and hurt. The stolen slippers had taken something precious from me, but they had also handed me a choice, to stay invisible and silenced, or to stand up and be seen no matter the cost. That choice marked the turning point, the moment when the catalyst became not just an end but a beginning. It was the first step on a path toward reclaiming my life and my identity, toward breaking free from the shadows where I had been trapped for far too long. In the quiet that followed the betrayal, I began to gather the pieces of myself. The slippers were gone, but the strength they had come to symbolize was still within me. The catalyst had struck deep, yes, but it had also cracked open a door I was now determined to walk through, no matter where it led. It was supposed to be a simple family visit, one of those afternoons that were meant to patch up the widening cracks between us, to remind me that despite everything, I still belonged somewhere, to someone. I had taken extra care that morning, brushing my thinning hair until it caught the light just right, slipping on my favorite cardigan, the one with tiny embroidered flowers along the cuffs, and, of course, putting on my slippers. Those slippers were more than just footwear. They were my armor against the cold floors and the invisible chill that seemed to hover around me lately. As I waited for my daughter's call to say they were on their way, I rehearsed the smiles I would wear, the words I would say to smooth over the quiet distance that had grown between us over the years. I was ready to forgive, or at least to pretend that nothing had changed, to step back into the role I had always played, the caregiver, the steady presence, the grandmother who baked cookies and listened with a patient smile. But what happened next was a betrayal not born of anger or cruelty, but of something far more insidious, indifference masked as a joke. When they arrived, the air was thick with an awkwardness I could not place, a tension hidden beneath their laughter and the cheerful chatter of the children. My son Daniel greeted me with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes, and my daughter-in-law Carla offered a polite nod, her attention already elsewhere, her hands busy with her phone as if it contained a secret that made the room less unbearable. The grandchildren, young and oblivious to the undercurrents, dashed past me, their voices rising in careless joy, but even their enthusiasm felt like a reminder of my outsider status. The house was pristine, every surface gleaming with the cold precision of a showroom rather than a home filled with warmth and memory. Not a single photograph featured me, no evidence of the years I had poured into this family, the birthdays celebrated, the nights spent soothing scraped knees or broken hearts. Instead, there were curated images of Carla's family, her parents on vacation, her children posed perfectly in matching outfits, a silent message of exclusion. The moment that shattered any remaining illusions came quietly but with devastating clarity. It started with a whispered exchange between Daniel and Carla, barely audible but heavy with meaning. "Hide her slippers. It'll be funny. She won't find them." I caught the words like a punch to the gut, unable to look away as they exchanged conspiratorial smiles, as if I were a character in a play they had written without me. My slippers, those soft, familiar tokens of my past, were taken while I was distracted in the kitchen, the very room where countless meals had been prepared with love and care. When I realized what had happened, I searched desperately, my feet aching against the cold tiles, my hands trembling as I called out for them. But my pleas were met with stifled giggles and the cold edge of mockery. They filmed me, the old woman shuffling barefoot, confusion clouding my eyes as I tried to gather my dignity from the floor like shattered glass. The video was shared first in a private family group chat, then, without my knowledge, posted to social media where strangers could watch and laugh. It wasn't just the loss of the slippers, but the way they weaponized my vulnerability, turning it into entertainment. A stranger, seeing the clip, reached out with a quiet message of sympathy, a lifeline in a sea of humiliation. The laughter in that video was not the warm, shared joy I remembered from family gatherings. It was sharp, cold, and merciless, slicing away at the fragile bonds that still held me tethered to them. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at family events shifted. What had begun as a joke hardened into a pattern of dismissiveness and passive cruelty. Comments like, "Oh, careful, Grandma might trip without her royal slippers," or "Better keep the slippers away or she might run off," became common, laced with laughter that felt more like scorn. Gifts arrived wrapped in bright paper, balloons tied to walkers, mugs emblazoned with patronizing slogans. I was no longer the matriarch or the respected elder. I was the punchline, the fragile old lady to be pitied or mocked. Even the staff here in the retirement home, picking up on the family's attitude, began calling me Slipper Queen, in a tone that seemed innocent but carried the weight of dismissal. My protests, my quiet requests for respect, were brushed aside or met with forced smiles. The slow erosion of my dignity was compounded by the isolation it brought. Invitations to family dinners stopped arriving. Phone calls went unanswered. Visits became rare and rushed. The laughter that once meant connection now served as a barrier, a reminder that I was no longer fully part of their lives. The children, once eager to sit at my feet and listen to stories, now looked past me, distracted by their phones or their own worlds. The warmth of family gatherings was replaced by a cold formality, a scripted politeness that left no room for the woman I was beneath the wrinkles and fading strength. I found myself retreating into the corners of the room, shrinking from the glare of those who once loved me, my heart heavy with a loneliness that words could not capture. Yet beneath this growing shadow, a flicker of defiance stirred. One afternoon, while going through an old box tucked away in my closet, I found my husband's tools, worn and familiar, the wooden handles smooth from years of use. Holding that hammer again, feeling its solid weight, I was transported back to a time when I was not just an observer of life but a builder of it. The memory of fixing creaky doors and loose cabinet hinges with him by my side reminded me that I was not helpless, not invisible, not a joke to be laughed at and forgotten. It was in that moment that I resolved I would reclaim my dignity, my identity, and my place in this world, even if it meant standing alone against those who sought to diminish me. The next family visit arrived with the usual fanfare, but a new undercurrent of tension. As the children took off their shoes at the door, I quietly retrieved the hammer and nails I had hidden away, my hand steady despite the pounding of my heart. With deliberate care, I nailed their shoes to the hardwood floor, each strike a quiet declaration of my presence and strength. When they saw what I had done, the laughter died in their throats, replaced by a stunned silence that filled the room with an electric charge. I sat calmly, my slippers warm beneath me, sipping tea as if nothing had changed, and said, "I thought we were still playing jokes. This one's mine." The shift in the room was palpable, and for the first time in a long while they looked at me not as a figure to mock, but as a woman who refused to be erased. This act was not out of anger, but a reclaiming of self, a boundary drawn firmly in the dust of their indifference. It was a turning point, a moment when the quiet victim became the quiet warrior. The eldest grandson, who had once joined in the laughter, now looked at me with a new respect, a silent acknowledgement that the woman before him was no longer willing to be sidelined. The days that followed brought small gestures, a photo of nailed shoes with the caption, "All under control, Grandma," and a subtle shift in how they treated me. It was not forgiveness or reconciliation, but it was the beginning of a new chapter, one written on my terms, with the hammer as my pen and the nailed shoes as my declaration. Through this, I learned that dignity is not granted by others, but taken by oneself. Sometimes, the hardest battles are fought not with words, but with quiet acts of defiance that speak louder than any apology. And sometimes, the deepest wounds are healed not by those who caused them, but by the strength we find within ourselves to stand tall again. After the stolen slippers incident, the days blurred into a series of muted, aching realizations that the family I once knew was slipping further and further away from me. The house that had been my sanctuary became a place where I was constantly reminded of my diminishing role, the soft echoes of laughter and whispered comments shadowing my every step. I found myself retreating more often into the quiet corners of the rooms, seeking refuge in solitude that was both balm and wound. The small acts of kindness that once defined family life were replaced by a cautious distance, a growing invisibility that seemed to seep into the very walls. It was during this slow unraveling that I made the decision to take a step I never thought I would, to leave the familiar and chart a course toward a new beginning, away from the weight of being unseen and unheard. The decision did not come in a sudden blaze of clarity, but in a series of quiet moments. Morning coffees sipped alone, afternoons spent gazing out windows at lives moving forward without me, nights filled with restless dreams of a freedom I had forgotten how to claim. I began to gather what I needed, not in haste, but with the measured care of someone reclaiming pieces of themselves scattered by neglect and time. My savings, tucked away in an old account that no one knew about, became my lifeline, a modest sum, carefully preserved through decades of careful budgeting, small sacrifices, and the occasional gift from my late husband. It was enough for a ticket, a room, a fresh start. I chose Portland on a whim, a city I hadn't seen in many years, but one that carried whispers of my past, the place where I first learned to ride a bicycle, where the rain had once felt like a cleansing, where the air still held a scent of pine and possibility. It was far enough to be distant, yet close enough to feel real. The night before my departure, I packed quietly, folding clothes with the precision that had been my habit for a lifetime, slipping my knitting and a few cherished books into my worn leather bag. I left a note tucked inside a drawer, a silent goodbye that needed no words, just the space for me to step away without the weight of explanation or apology. The airport was a swirl of lights and sounds, a place that once held the promise of journeys, taken with loved ones now transformed into a threshold I crossed alone. I purchased my ticket in cash, feeling the strange thrill of autonomy that came from using my own money, my own will. Boarding the plane, I slipped my slippers from my bag and wore my old shoes, the ones I had nailed firmly to the floor during my last visit, a symbol of the power I was reclaiming. The flight was quiet, the city lights falling away beneath me like the last traces of the life I had left behind. I didn't look back. Arriving in Portland late at night, the air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of earth and rain that was both foreign and familiar. I found a small motel, nothing grand but clean and honest, with a creaky staircase and a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of cleaning fluid and stories long told. Room 207 became my refuge, a space to rest, to breathe, to begin again. I lay on the bed fully clothed, the scratchy blanket pulling at my arms but unable to touch the sense of relief that had settled deep within. Sleep came without dreams, a rare gift after years of restless nights filled with memories and regrets. The following morning, the world outside was soft with morning mist, the neighborhood awakening in slow, gentle rhythms. I walked cautiously, my legs remembering the steady pace of years gone by, my hip reminding me of its limits, but refusing to be an excuse. I stopped at a small bakery, the scent of fresh bread and coffee wrapping around me like an embrace. The woman behind the counter smiled kindly when I handed her exact change, and though she asked if I was from around there, I only replied softly that I used to be a long time ago. Her welcome felt genuine, a small thread of connection in a new tapestry I was beginning to weave. Housing was next. A corkboard by the bakery door held notes: rooms for rent, dog walking, used bikes, mundane details of everyday life that suddenly meant everything to me. A handwritten note caught my eye. For quiet lady. Private room, shared kitchen, no nonsense, no drama, $400 per month. Call Joyce. The blunt simplicity spoke to me, a promise of no pretenses, just an honest place to belong. I took a photo of the number, a lifeline thrown across the uncertainty. By afternoon, I stood on a faded porch with peeling paint, facing Joyce, a woman with a cigarette in one hand and a cat curled around her ankles, who sized me up with a wary eye. Her house smelled of lavender and fried onions, lived in and real, unlike the sterile perfection I had left behind. The room she offered was small but filled with sunlight, a twin bed, a worn dresser, and a window that opened onto the quiet street below. It was not much, but it was mine. The routine began to take shape. I found work in a local cafe, a place of burnt toast smells and early mornings, of coffee cups and worn aprons. I was slow at first, my feet aching, my hands unfamiliar with the rhythm, but I remembered the steady beat of service, the focus on others that silenced the noise inside. The first paycheck was small, a few dollars after taxes, but it was pure, earned by my own hands, and it felt like a victory. Each day brought new small choices: a wool coat bought in a second-hand shop, crosswords from the morning paper, a cinnamon roll from a kind manager who saw beyond my age and whispered encouragement in quiet moments. I was no longer just someone's grandmother. I was a woman carving out a space where I belonged, where I was seen not for what I once was, but for who I was becoming. The ache in my feet softened as the weeks passed, replaced by a quiet strength that grew with every step. Every shift worked, every plate carried without spilling. The past was still there, whispering in the edges of my thoughts, but I was learning to live with it, to let it be a shadow rather than a chain. I kept my phone off most days, avoiding calls that might pull me back into old roles, into the scripts written by others. Instead, I savored the small moments: a cup of tea on the porch, the soft purr of a cat at my feet, the unexpected friendship of a woman who didn't ask for explanations, only offered company. This was the first escalation, the quiet but unyielding step away from invisibility, the beginning of a journey that no one else could take for me. It was the choice to live on my terms, to find dignity not in the approval of others, but in the simple, stubborn act of choosing myself every day. In the quiet rhythm of my new life, something began to shift, not with sudden fireworks or dramatic gestures, but with the gentle unfolding of small, deliberate acts that slowly reclaimed pieces of myself I had long thought lost. The days in Portland settled into a pattern, each morning starting with the familiar scent of brewing coffee in the cafe where I worked, the steady clink of cups, and the murmur of early risers forming a comforting backdrop to my thoughts. I was no longer defined by the family who had discarded me or the loneliness that had once threatened to swallow me whole. Instead, I was becoming a woman who belonged to herself, who carried her own stories and dreams without apology or shame. The room I rented from Joyce, that small sanctuary bathed in afternoon light, became more than just a place to sleep. It became a space where I could breathe freely, where the walls bore witness to my quiet resilience rather than my hidden pain. Joyce herself, gruff but not unkind, was a steady presence, her sharp wit and unvarnished honesty a balm against the softness of my own doubts. She never pried, never asked about the life I had left behind, but her occasional grunts and the way she poured me a glass of wine without question spoke volumes. In her company, I found a kind of companionship that was both freeing and grounding, a reminder that connection need not always be loud or demanding to be real. Work at the cafe was a revelation. At first, my movements were slow, cautious, my feet unaccustomed to the long hours spent on them, my hands relearning the delicate balance of carrying plates and pouring coffee without spilling. But the rhythm came, steady and sure, a pulse that echoed the beating of my own heart as it grew stronger with each shift. Heather, the manager, was a woman of few words but sharp eyes, and her quiet acceptance was a lifeline. When she slipped me a cinnamon roll wrapped in foil one morning, muttering about there being too many, it was more than just a gesture of kindness. It was a recognition that I belonged, that I was valued not for what I had been, but for who I was. Becoming. Each paycheck was a small victory, a tangible proof of my independence and my ability to support myself. I began to carry my own money again, folding bills neatly into my worn wallet, feeling a thrill in the simple act of paying for things without needing anyone's permission or assistance. The first coat I bought, a navy wool piece with a subtle herringbone pattern, was not just clothing, but a statement. I tried it on in the quiet of a second-hand shop, feeling the weight of its fabric and the warmth it promised. And for the first time in years, I looked in the mirror and saw not the woman they had dismissed, but someone strong and worthy of care. Outside the cafe, the neighborhood began to feel like home. I wandered the streets on my days off, exploring parks and bakeries, discovering small corners of warmth in a city that had once been just a memory. The kindness of strangers, the gentle nods of recognition from shopkeepers, the simple pleasure of a scone bought with exact change. All of these threads wove together into a tapestry of belonging that wrapped around me like a soft quilt. It was a slow process, this reweaving of identity, but with each step, I felt the bonds of the past loosen, making room for something new. Letters came from my grandson, Kieran, the only family member who reached out without judgment or expectation. His words were cautious but filled with warmth, a bridge across the distance that had grown between us. When he visited, alone and unpressured, we shared quiet moments that were unburdened by the past, talking about books, birds, and the small joys that make life bearable. His presence was a balm, a reminder that even in the fractured landscape of family, pockets of love and understanding could still bloom. And yet, even as I built this new life, the shadows of the past lingered at the edges. The arrival of letters from my son and daughter-in-law, filled with thinly veiled accusations and demands, tested my resolve. They spoke of concern and reasonableness, but beneath the words lay an expectation that I would return to the role they had written for me, a role of obedience and invisibility. I read their messages carefully, folding them away like fragile paper boats in a stormy sea, and made the choice to hold my ground. My response was quiet but firm, a letter not of anger, but of finality. I was done being their pawn, their source of worry and control. I was a woman who had found her own voice and was no longer willing to be silenced. This midpoint, this turning inward and outward at once, was not marked by dramatic confrontations or grand declarations, but by a steady reclaiming of self. It was the moment when the pain of exclusion transformed into the power of choice, when the weight of loss was balanced by the lightness of new beginnings. In the quiet corners of my rented room, under the soft glow of a desk lamp, I began to write again. Not letters to those who had hurt me, but to myself. Words of affirmation and hope, reminders of strength and worth, messages that no longer sought permission, but gave it instead. The transformation was subtle, but profound. I was no longer just surviving, I was living. The act of choosing myself every day, in small but meaningful ways, became an act of rebellion and resilience. The slippers they stole had been more than just shoes. They were a symbol of everything I had lost. But in reclaiming my story, I found something even more valuable: the freedom to walk my own path, in my own shoes, on my own terms. And in that freedom, I discovered a peace I had not known was possible. The quiet life I had begun to build in Portland, with its gentle rhythms and small victories, was suddenly unsettled by the arrival of echoes from a past I thought I had left behind. The second escalation, unlike the first, which was marked by a sudden departure and a symbolic reclaiming of self, crept in slowly, with the weight of old wounds and new expectations pressing down on me from unexpected directions. It began with a letter, its envelope plain but the handwriting unmistakable. My grandson Kieran's. His words were cautious and kind, a lifeline reaching across the growing distance between us, a reminder that not all ties were severed. He spoke of worry, of missing me, of the family's unrest since my departure. But more than that, he offered hope, a fragile thread that invited me back into a connection on my own terms. Reading his letter in the quiet of my small room, I felt a flicker of warmth I hadn't expected, a softening of the hardened edges that had protected me for so long. Yet even as I held on to this hope, the storm of the past was gathering on the horizon. The days that followed brought a flurry of contact attempts, not just from Kieran, but from others I had once called family. Phone calls went unanswered, messages left unreturned, until finally the weight of their presence could no longer be ignored. One afternoon, as I was leaving the cafe after a morning shift, a figure stood waiting outside. It was Lisa, my daughter-in-law, her expression guarded, but her eyes betraying a mix of determination and uncertainty. The air between us was thick with unspoken history as she stepped inside the cafe, her gaze scanning the room before settling on me. The place was nearly empty, save for the familiar presence of Arthur, the steady man who had become a quiet companion in this new chapter of my life. Lisa's voice was low, her words tentative, as she asked if we could talk privately. I nodded, gesturing toward an empty booth at the back, the kind of space where secrets and truths are often laid bare. Her explanation was a hurried attempt at reconciliation, framed by panic and regret. She spoke of the chaos on the day I was left behind, the frantic rush of boarding calls, the cranky children, the fear that I had somehow been lost in the shuffle. Her words were laced with excuses, apologies that felt rehearsed yet heartfelt in their own flawed way. But beneath the surface, I saw the performance for what it was, a calculated effort to regain control, to rewrite the narrative that had been fractured by my absence. When I reminded her of the 8 hours I had waited alone in the airport lounge, of the calls I made that went unanswered, the silence that followed was deafening. She looked down, her manicured hands betraying a tension that no words could ease. The arrival of a lawyer's letter shortly thereafter only confirmed the seriousness of their intentions. Derek Sorensen, representing my son and daughter-in-law, reached out with carefully worded concern about my well-being and the management of my assets. The legal tone, the formal requests for meetings and evaluations felt like an intrusion, a reminder that my independence was still contested, that the fight for my dignity was far from over. I responded with calm but unwavering clarity, informing him that I was of sound mind, living safely, and not under duress. Any further attempts to contact me under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. This letter was my shield, my declaration that I was no longer the person they could manipulate or dismiss. Amidst this tension, Kieran's letters remained a constant balm. His words spoke of his struggles, his desire to understand, and his hope for a relationship unburdened by the past. When he visited, alone and unpressured, we found a fragile but genuine connection. We talked not of blame or loss, but of simple things: books, birds, the quiet joys that stitch a life together. His presence was a reminder that while some ties fray beyond repair, others can be rewoven with care and patience. The contrast between Kieran's gentle outreach and the heavy-handedness of the rest of my family was stark, a painful but necessary distinction. Then came the public exposure, a newspaper article that portrayed me as the missing matriarch, with my family's voices echoing concern and confusion. The piece was both a relief and a provocation, bringing my story into the open, but also exposing the performative nature of their worry. I read their words with a mixture of amusement and bitterness. The careful avoidance of the truth about the airport lounge, the portrayal of me as vulnerable and lost, rather than as a woman who had made a conscious choice to reclaim her life. The article became a symbol of their inability to see me as I truly was, trapped in their need to control the narrative. Throughout this turmoil, Arthur remained a steady presence. His visits to the cafe, his quiet questions and stories, offered a grounding counterpoint to the chaos. He didn't pry or judge. He simply listened and shared small moments of companionship that felt genuine and healing. His kindness was a quiet testament to the possibility of connection beyond family, a reminder that chosen bonds can be just as vital as those of blood. The tensions reached a head when Lisa appeared again, this time not just with words, but with a tangible offer of reconciliation, a small envelope containing money for Kieran, a peace offering wrapped in unspoken conditions. I accepted it not out of need, but as a gesture of closure, refusing to let it become a tool for manipulation. When she confessed that she never intended to replace me, but simply wanted space from my shadow, I saw in her words the complex blend of guilt and self-preservation that often colors family dynamics. My response was firm. I was no shadow to be cast aside, but a person reclaiming her own light. The visits from legal representatives, the persistent calls, the appearances of family members oscillated between confrontation and tentative peace. Each encounter tested my resolve, challenging the boundaries I had set, but also affirming the strength I had cultivated. I found myself writing letters, not just to them, but to myself, affirmations of my worth and choices, declarations that no longer sought permission, but granted it freely. Through it all, I learned that reclaiming dignity is a journey marked by both setbacks and triumphs, by moments of doubt and surges of courage. The second escalation was not just an external battle, but an internal one, a test of my ability to stand firm in the face of those who sought to diminish me. It was a crucible that refined my sense of self and strengthened my commitment to live life on my own terms. In the quiet aftermath, as the dust settled on the clashes and concessions, I found a new kind of peace, not in the approval of others, but in the certainty of my own voice. The past had come knocking, bringing both pain and opportunity, and I had answered not with fear, but with the steady grace of a woman who knows her worth. This was no longer a story of loss, but one of resilience, of a life reclaimed piece by piece, of a heart that refused to be silenced. I wrote the letter one evening when the sky outside my window had turned a deep shade of indigo, and the soft hum of the city had quieted to a gentle whisper. The room was bathed in the warm glow of a single lamp, its light casting long shadows that danced quietly against the walls, as if the night itself was bearing witness to the moment. My hands, steady and deliberate, moved across the paper, not with anger or bitterness, but with a calm certainty that had taken months to cultivate. The words I chose were clear, precise, and final, a declaration of my autonomy and an unequivocal refusal to be drawn back into the patterns of control and neglect that had marked so much of my past. I told them I was of sound mind, living safely, and not under duress. I warned that any further attempts to contact me under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. It was a legal shield, yes, but also a deeply personal boundary, drawn not with hostility, but with the quiet strength of a woman reclaiming her life. This letter was the culmination of a long journey, one that had taken me from the depths of humiliation and exclusion to a place of quiet power and self-possession. It was not written in haste or fury, but in the measured tone of someone who had seen too much to be easily shaken, someone who had learned that the greatest act of resistance is often the refusal to be silenced. Sending it off the next morning, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a sense of finality that was both liberating and a little frightening. I knew that from this moment on, there would be no more half measures, no more waiting for permission or approval. I had made my choice, and it was irrevocable. The days that followed were marked by a new kind of stillness. The calls stopped, The letters ceased, and the visits dwindled until the only voices I heard were those I chose to keep close. The steady friendship of Joyce, the gentle companionship of Arthur, and the comforting routine of my work at the cafe. This silence was not empty, but filled with possibility, a space where I could rebuild without interference or judgment. I began to fill my days with small pleasures, baking lemon squares for a community potluck, walking through neighborhoods that smelled of rain and lilacs, reading poetry late into the night. Each act was a stitch in the fabric of a new life, one woven from resilience, dignity, and self-respect. When Lisa came to the cafe that gray Thursday afternoon, it was not as the woman who had once dismissed me, but as someone seeking a fragile reconciliation. Her coat was tailored and too fine for the drizzle outside, her posture stiff with hesitation. She waited while I finished my tasks, watching but not interrupting, as if unsure how to bridge the gulf between us. When she finally approached, her voice was low, carrying the weight of unspoken regrets as she asked if we could talk privately. The booth at the back became our quiet confessional, a place where years of hurt and misunderstanding were laid bare without the usual defenses. She spoke of panic and fear, of the chaos that had led to my abandonment, and of the complicated emotions that had followed. But her words also revealed a deeper truth, the need to reclaim control, to reshape the family narrative in a way that excluded the difficult realities of neglect and betrayal. I listened without interruption, my gaze steady and unyielding. When she confessed that she had never intended to replace me, but only to carve out space free from my shadow, I saw in her admission a sliver of honesty, rare and precious. My response was measured and firm. I was not a shadow to be cast aside, but a person reclaiming her own light. She left without finishing her coffee, the silence between us heavy but no longer hostile. That night, Joyce and I sat wrapped in blankets on the porch, the air thick with the scent of rain and wood smoke. Her question, "You really said that?" was met with a quiet nod, and together we toasted with lukewarm tea to the people who stop asking for permission. In that moment, surrounded by the steady presence of friendship and the soft murmur of the night, I felt a deep and abiding peace. The final cut had been made, not with anger, but with grace, not with vengeance, but with the quiet resolve of a woman who had finally stepped out of the shadows and into the light of her own making. The morning light spilled softly through the thin curtains of my small room, casting a pale glow over the worn wooden floor and the neatly folded clothes resting on the chair. I sat by the window, the quiet hum of the city waking up beneath me, and felt a stillness inside that was both new and deeply familiar. After months of turmoil, betrayal, and rebuilding, I had come to a place where the past no longer held the power to unsettle me. The decisions I had made, the departures, the boundaries, the letters, had woven together into a tapestry of resilience and quiet victory. I was no longer the woman they thought they could dismiss or control. I was whole, on my own terms. The letter from Kieran had arrived just days before, carried by the gentle hands of a courier and marked with the hopeful urgency of youth. His handwriting, large and deliberate, filled the page with words that reached across the distance we had both traveled in our own ways. "Grandma, I'm coming to Portland. I want to see you. I'm not bringing anyone. I just want to talk." The invitation was simple, unpressured, and full of promise. It was a bridge offered without expectation, a chance to begin again with someone who had always seen me, even when others could not. I folded the letter carefully, tucking it close like a fragile treasure, and knew that when the time was right, I would cross that bridge. In the days that followed, I prepared, not for a reunion, but for a meeting of equals, two souls seeking connection beyond the fractured history. I chose my navy coat, the one that had come to symbolize my new life, and dressed with quiet care. Not for him, not for anyone else, but for myself, for the woman who had reclaimed her story and walked steadily into the light. I did not tell Joyce where I was going, and she did not ask. There was a mutual understanding, a respect for the paths we each walked, sometimes together and sometimes apart. The Redfern Motel was modest, its faded paint and narrow hallways a far cry from the polished surfaces I had left behind, but perfectly suited to the sincerity of our encounter. Kieran opened the door with a tentative smile, the same gentle kindness that had always been his hallmark. We did not rush into embraces or apologies, but shared quiet moments filled with the unspoken understanding of two hearts healing. His room smelled of takeout and hotel soap, cluttered with books that spoke of his search for knowledge and meaning. We talked of small things and big things, of the life he was building and the freedom I was claiming. There were no tears, no recriminations, only the steady beat of a connection rekindled. When he handed me a small bundle wrapped in paper, a collection of poems underlined with notes that spoke directly to my heart, I felt the profoundness of our bond, fragile yet enduring, marked by distance, but not broken by it. The line that stayed with me, "There are women who rise not from fire, but from forgetting who told them they couldn't," became a mantra, a reminder of the quiet strength that had carried me through. Returning to the cafe the next day, I wore a new apron Heather had found in a clearance bin, its deep green fabric embroidered with the words, "Not your grandma's kitchen." The laughter it sparked was full and genuine, a celebration of the woman I was becoming. Arthur, ever steady, raised his mug in salute, a silent toast to the journey we had both traveled. At home, the familiar warmth of Joyce's kitchen awaited, the scent of garlic and slow-cooked meals filling the air. Franklin, the cat, greeted me with a grumble and a headbutt, the small rituals of daily life grounding me in the present. We ate quietly, sharing comfort without the need for words. On a quiet evening, I sat on the porch with pen and paper, writing a letter, not to anyone else but to myself. "Dear me," I began, "you waited so long for someone to save you. You forgot you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them. They let go. And you finally let go back." I folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside my dresser drawer behind the old recipe cards, a secret reminder of the journey I had taken. This was no longer a story of loss or abandonment, but one of renewal and quiet triumph. I had stepped out of the shadows, reclaimed my voice, and built a life on my own terms. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I was whole, and that was enough. If this story finds you at the right moment, know this: you do not have to wait for permission or a perfect sign to choose yourself. You are your own signal in the silence, your own step away from the airport lounge, your own story waiting to be written. When you do, come back and tell me. I will be here, ready to listen and to believe in the strength you have found.